Remember, we've been talking about all the different tools and ways that you can do international business. That's what we just finished. That was these previous slides that had all the different ways to do it. Where's that slide? That. And we've gone through and talked about each one of those. Okay, why has this all changed? Well, to go to that reason, we want to go back to World War II, basically. And it's all happened after World War II. Remember, I told you about Japan. Before World War II, you couldn't even go to Japan as a tourist, much less move there, open a business, use Japanese resources, and go from there. We taught them how to do that after the war when we were occupying Japan. So the world became a much smaller place because of World War II. People were displaced all over the world. They wanted things. This all led to this. Changes in government's attitude. The fact that technology has changed and you can work on a project 24/7 like we talked about Bob in India. Things of that nature. More competition, having to keep up with the competition. There's just a whole bunch of reasons why this has just exploded, and it has. Now, that slide is out of place. All right. Y'all, I'm not going to get into this, the economic part of this that much, but, you know, it's got to be good for both sides to do the international business is what it boils down to. And if it's not, it can be unfair to one, it can hurt the other, you know, whichever way it is. Well, sometimes the government has to step in and make people play by the rules or protect their domestic businesses. That's where the national policy can change. Now, we've been talking about expand, open trade policy. That's not always the case. All right, it boils down to an argument between free trade and fair trade. Okay, y'all, free trade used to mean total, independent, no government interference in international business. Okay, that's not what it means anymore. It means minimal governmental interference. Everybody accepts the fact that there's got to be some governmental interference. The government's got to, your domestic government has to protect you, be there, because not all countries of the world, like China, play by the rules. And sometimes you've got to depend on your government to protect you. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. What this leads to is some government involvement. Now, fair traders are the other side. And they say, well, wait a minute, getting anybody else to play by the rules? Yeah, right. They're never going to play fair. So the government's got to be the referee. The government's got to step in. The government always has to be there and protect us and make sure that everybody is trading fairly. So one wants no to minimal governmental interference. That's the free traders. Fair traders say, no, that's not reality. Reality is people are going to be lying, cheating, stealing, not playing fairly, so the government has to get involved and protect us. The true way the government looks at it is probably somewhere in the middle. The government does get involved and does regulate international business. Okay, how do they do it? They do it by putting up trade barriers. By stopping you from abusing the system, if you will. Now, do some countries, either in their zeal to be fair or not caring about being fair and want to protect their own domestic businesses or their own money, do they actively get involved and they don't play by the rules with these trade barriers? See, a trade barrier can be just that. It can be a barrier to trade, whether for good purposes or not. These are greatly looked down upon in the international community. And the push since World War II, as we're going to talk about in the next chapter, has tried to be to get rid of these. But reality is still reality. All right, your number one source of trade barriers is a tariff. That's, I believe, a French word. It just is a fancy word for taxes. Can you make people pay to do business with you? That one is really looked down upon. Tariffs do two things. They serve as a trade barrier. Can they also be a revenue raiser for the country? And international businesses say, well, why do I want to make you make money? You government that I'm going to be taking your products into. That doesn't seem fair. I'm not a citizen of yours. Why should I pay you taxes? So these are greatly frowned on in the international community. Quotas is another way of doing it. Okay, y'all, quota doesn't mean anything secretive here. If I put a quota on A's, would that mean that only a certain limited number of you could get A's in this class? Okay, well, there is no quota on A's. If all of y'all earn an A in this class, you're going to get it. Now, that's not true when a country imposes quotas. Y'all, an absolute quota means you can only bring in so much of your foreign goods, period. That's an absolute quota. Y'all, the United States government can look at Toyota and say, you can only bring in 100,000 cars this year, and that's it. No more Toyotas after that. Well, that's an absolute quota. All right, this is also looked down upon. And so a lot of times you'll see governments combine the two. And you'll have tariff rate quotas. Put the two together. We'll talk about that in just a minute. Then, since those two are so looked down on, you get countries like Japan that get to be real sneaky. And they come up with ways to put up trade barriers that don't have anything to do with quotas or tariffs. These are called non-quantitative, non-tariff barriers, NQNTBs. And these can be pretty sneaky. And the United States does it too. I'm not just pointing at Japan. Japan's just a lot better at it. There's lots of ways of doing NQNTBs. Here we go again. Strange as it sounds, y'all. If I can keep those two wires from touching each other, sometimes it works. But this one doesn't want to cooperate. Maybe. I don't know. All right. We talked all semester. Consumer Product Safety Commission, others. Do they have product testing standards? Well, if I have one set of standards for my domestic companies and a much higher standard for other foreign-made goods, can you see where I could protect my local domestic people easier? Japan's a master at this one, y'all. They'll require one set of standards for Japanese-made products and then a much higher standard, hence more cost for the imports. And so if you want to buy the cheaper good, you'll buy the Japanese-made. And it may be of the same quality. Well, which one would you buy? The quality made at home or a foreign good that cost you more money? And then we'll talk about several others. We'll go through each one of those and talk about what they are. All right, let's start with tariffs. Like I said, this is a tax. Lots of different types here. Your most common one is an import tariff. If you're going to bring it into my country, I'm going to charge you to bring it in. Y'all, an import tariff would be if you're bringing in a car made in another country, it costs whatever it costs to bring it here and to make it, plus the government adds on a fee, a tax for each one that comes in. Export tariffs are the opposite. You're going to take my raw materials where you're going to pay to get them. And so for every ton of whatever you take out of my country, you're going to pay a fee to take it. Transit tariffs are very beneficial to countries that are strategically located. When I think of this, I always think of Egypt. Do a lot of goods get shipped up and down the Nile River? Well, who's at the end of the Nile River? Egypt. So what Egypt says is, all right, if you want to bring goods down the Nile River or up the Nile River through Egypt, now they're not buying these goods. They're not getting them at all. They're going into the interior of Africa. Then Egypt looks at you and says, well, then you got to pay to do it. That's a transit tariff. If you're going to ship it across my country, you have to pay me. That's pretty much just a revenue raiser if you think about it. Because you're not buying it anyway. It's not a trade barrier. It's a revenue raiser. Ad valorem tariffs, that can be you add value to something because of what it is. The more expensive, the more you pay, things of this nature. Specific tariffs, that could be on one specific unit just to protect one specific type of good back in the domestic product. Compound tariffs, put any of those together. You could have a transit tariff and an export tariff. You're going to take it out of my country, you're going to pay to take it out, plus you're taking it out, so you got to pay another fee to take it out. You're going through my country, then taking it out, you get hit with two. Purposes here, remember, raise revenue for the government, but also trade barrier. But the big source here, and that's why people don't like it so much, is it raises revenue for that country. Now the quotas, the absolute quota, y'all, is an absolute amount. An absolute quota, y'all, is that's it. That's all you're going to bring in. But a lot of times they'll combine it with a tariff rate quota. All right, our example a while ago was that Toyota could bring in 100,000 cars and that was it. Okay, a tariff rate quota may be, well, we'll let you bring in 50,000 at no rate, there for free, but then the next 10,000 you bring in, you got to pay this much of a tax, then for the next 10,000 this much, and the next 10,000, and y'all, it's going up as you're letting more in. Well, does it get to the point where you can't afford to bring them in? And that does both. It gets the money and puts the quota on. But like I said, those two aren't preferred. So a lot of times countries come up with these NQNTBs. They're not quotas, they're not tariffs, they're just bureaucratic or legalistic. They're hidden. And then the country could say, well, that's not what we meant from that. Well, that's exactly what they meant from it. But it doesn't look as bad. And like I said, y'all, Japan's a master of a lot of these. These are difficult to challenge and get changed because they're so embedded in the country's psyche, way of thinking. A lot of times they don't want to change it, and they won't. And like I said, a lot of times this looks like it's a legitimate reason. It's for real. But if you dig deeper, you see it's really a trade barrier. These are the ones that are even more controversial because they're so downright sneaky. Okay? And it's not just foreign countries that do this, y'all. Our country does this too. So let's go through each one of these. The first one's probably the most obvious. And that's that product testing and standards and things of that nature. We require that. We just talked about the EPA with poisons. Did you have to test them, make sure they fit, pay the fees, all that type of stuff? Well, if you have one standard for domestically made poisons under FIFRA, but you have a much higher standard for things coming in from other countries, that's what we're talking about here. That makes it into a trade barrier. Because what you're really doing is making the import cost a lot more money than the domestic product, so people buy the domestic product. Japan does this with skis, snow skis. And a lot of other things. Like I said, they're a master of these NQNTBs, y'all. Japan is just, well, look at World War II. They're just very sneaky. And it continues here. Now, that one's pretty obvious. These might not be so obvious. Let's talk public procurement. This is where they put laws in that favor the purchase of domestic goods over foreign goods. Okay, Brazil, y'all. Remember how I slipped it in last time that Brazil required you to use Brazilian computers if you were a Brazilian company? Well, here's how they did it. What they'd do is they would say, when you're putting out the bids for the computer equipment, as long as the Brazilian company is within 12% of their lowest bid, then you got to take the Brazilian bid. Well, y'all, a lot of your Central and South American countries, is bribery, finding out what the other bids are, is that normal? So could the Brazilian computer companies find out who's the lowest bidder add on 11.5% just to be sure, then would they for sure get the bid? And you had to buy the Brazilian computers if you were a Brazilian company. Which would mean everybody had to buy Brazilian computers. Okay? Now, they don't have a rule that says that, but is that what happens because of this, with the local purchase requirement? And a lot of countries, public procurement, a lot of countries do that. Now, local purchase requirements are where they just flat out come out and say, yeah, we'll let you come in here, we'll let you do business here, as long as you hire local people and you buy the raw materials in our country. This could be totally, this could be so much. France does this with the EU on American television programs. So many, a percentage of, in France, TV programs have to be French in nature, then so many have to be of European production under the EU, and then the rest of them you can bring in American-made TV shows and show them. But they promote their own market first. Sneaky way of doing it, Japan's a master of this one, y'all. Access to distribution centers. Yeah, they'll come in and let you build a business, but you can't ship it anywhere in Japan. And they won't let you bring it into Japan because you can't get any way to get it from the dock to the business because they limit your access to distribution systems. Oh, they'll say, yeah, we have free trade. There's no problem. But when you get a shipload of cars there, can you get it to a dealership? First of all, they wouldn't let you have one. You'd have to put it with a Japanese dealership. And then they won't let you do that because they're afraid that the Japanese auto industry will blackball them, so they won't do it. You can't distribute them. This affects franchises, things of that nature. Regulatory procedures. This is very similar to the first one we talked about. But you can just blatantly put an additional fee on of some sort. Well, we're not sure that your alcohol is as safe as ours that we make, so for us to test it and check it out, we're going to have to charge you a special testing fee. Well, has it already been tested in a domestic company or country? Is that just a way to make the local liquor, beer, wine, whatever it is, cheaper than the import? They don't really test it. They don't really charge you. They just hit you with a higher excess tax for some reason. Whether they really use it or not, depends. Then some countries just flat out, remember with FDI and FPI, they may put bans on you. Now this usually is on FDI. And a lot of countries do this. I used to have a friend that was an Australian attorney. I met him here in the country. And I joked with him and I said, what we need to do is just open a law firm and I'll move over to Australia. And he said, that's fine with me. And I said, okay, well, what's the catch? He said, well, in Australia, you can't own property because you're foreign. And every business has to be owned by an Australian. And so you've got to put everything in my name. And if I get mad at you, it's all mine. And, one of the attorneys I worked for had a daughter that moved to Australia. She opened up a dress shop with an Australian girl. They got mad about something. The Australian girl said, well, it's all in my name. Why don't you go home? Didn't give her a dime. Now, I don't know whether that's still Australia's rule, but, that's to keep you from moving in and taking over the Australian marketplace. We do that. Airlines. Our airlines have to be owned 75% by Americans. Only 25% or up to 25% can be foreign owned. Now that's stock shell. That's even FPI. Okay. So, plain and simple, y'all, a lot of countries of the world like Japan are very sneaky about this. And this is either the general public doesn't know what's going on or they actively support it to protect their domestic industry. But sometimes, like in the United States, does money talk? And do certain industries buy off congressmen and get Congress to put these in for political reasons, simply to protect that domestic industry so that they don't have to compete and they don't have to spend the money or all the problems? And who gets hurt by that? You, the consumers. Do we end up paying a whole lot more money than we should for our domestic goods just to protect the domestic companies? Sugar is the example in the book on that one. So if we don't like these trade barriers, why don't we do something about it? All right, let's move to chapter 16 and talk about what do you try to do about it. All right, for just a minute, though, we got to back up. We got to get to where, how did we get to where we are with this international business? And why do we have some of these international organizations? Okay, to answer that, you got to go back to World War I. Okay, y'all, World War I was a battle between England, France, Italy, other European powers against Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. Okay, y'all, the Ottoman Empire was huge. It's now Turkey. Germany got the blame for this war. That's the one that everybody was really mad at. And y'all, was World War I a very bitter, horrible war? Y'all, if you watch all that new Russell Crowe movie that's coming out, it's not here yet, but y'all, it's about World War I. And Australia played a big part in that, especially in the Battle of Gallipoli. Or if you go back and look at an old Mel Gibson Australian movie named Gallipoli. And y'all, it shows you the close contact and how hand-to-hand combat was used. Or if you watch War Horse, where the horse is running between, in no man's land, between the ditches. And you can see how horrible this really was. They used mustard gas, Germany. A lot of people got gassed. They used weapons of mass destruction, y'all. This was a very bitter war. So when the war was over, they wanted Germany to pay. Remember, y'all, they took away a lot of land from Germany, gave it to the surrounding countries. They destroyed the Ottoman Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire and broke them up into several different countries. But Germany, they hit and said, okay, you got to pay war reparations. Well, Germany wasn't stupid, y'all. Germany hyperinflates their economy, pays off the war debt in worthless money. But what that do to your German industrialists who had made millions of marks during World War I who had money in the bank? Well, if a mark becomes worthless, did the von whoever family just lose everything they had, except their title? That led to high unemployment in Germany at first because, companies had to lay people off. They couldn't pay them. The other countries would say, well, we don't want to trade with you, Germany, so they may raise tariffs on them. Well, Germany started stabbing everybody else in the back. They started lowering their prices so much. I mean, after all, y'all, you may hate a country because they make something. Oh, like certain countries, we don't like their politics, but they have oil. Well, y'all, if oil at one of those stations that's owned by a foreign government is half of what it is with a domestic company, do you forget political differences real quick? And that's kind of what happened. So when Germany lowered their price so much on, say, wine, beer, cheese, chocolates, whatever, well, did even the French start to say, well, we just won't pretend like it's German. So they started buying the German products because they were so much cheaper. Well, what does that do to French-made products? Nobody's buying them. So does France have to lay people off? Do they have to lower their prices to compete with Germany? Can you see where economically this is just taking you down the tubes? And that's what happened, and y'all led to the Great Depression. Okay, y'all, how much of this class have we talked about the Great Depression? right, y'all, I'm going to change the mics and see if it works. Maybe. Okay, now I've got them all messed up. Is this one on? All right. Can y'all hear me as well on this one? No? It's not working? How about now? Yeah. All right. Let's hope it doesn't start buzzing because I don't have another one I can trade to. So, anyway, that leads to the Great Depression, which leads to economic chaos, which leads to political chaos, which leads to Mussolini in Italy, which leads Hitler in Germany, and gives us World War II. Okay, y'all, no matter how you look at it, was World War II bigger than World War I? All right, have I also told you several times that after a war, do you have a recession, if not a full-blown depression? Okay, with World War II being so much bigger global than World War I, what kind of depression would come after World War II compared to World War I if the same things were done? People didn't want to think about it. The Greater Depression? I mean, they didn't want to think about that. So, even before the war was over, in late 1944, 44 Allied nations met in this little hamlet up in New Hampshire called Bretton Woods. Really? Okay, if I don't move, maybe. Called Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. These 44 Allied nations met to try to say, what can we do at the end of World War II What can we do at the end of World War II to keep the economic problems from World War I occurring? They came up with two international organizations. First one is the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. That's called the World Bank. Okay, I was going to try this one as much as I hate it, but it's dead. So the problem, y'all, is if I don't keep the mic on, otherwise I just yell. Then those of you that listen to the videos, again, there's no sound. So I've got to keep the mic on, and I'll try to keep the static down to a minimum, okay? It is working right now, correct? Okay. I'm trying not to move. But anyway, they came up with a World Bank. Okay, all those allied nations contributed money so that this bank was well stocked with money to make loans to all of Europe after World War II, not just the defeated countries. I mean, not just the victor nations. No of this dumping it all on Germany and Italy and making them pay so that they don't do the beggar not a neighbor philosophy, stab each other in the back, cause all the harsh economic conditions. Then the other thing that they created was the International Monetary Fund. Remember, Germany had devalued their currency. Okay, the International Monetary Fund stopped that. And nobody could do that because everybody's currency was fixed at that time to the U.S. dollar. It made sense to put it to the U.S. dollar because of all the economies of the victor nations was the U.S. hurt the least. That's going to actually last y'all into the 1970s in some situations. So these two are extremely important. Remember, the World Bank was for all of Europe. It still exists. It's not still rebuilding Europe. Now it goes and gives loans to the tune of $28 billion a year on average to less developed countries in the world for long-term interest loans. Build power plants, do this, long-term projects. All right, the International Monetary Fund, remember I told you lasted until 1971. It's still around. You'll see it come into play when some natural disaster happens. So would you expect the IMF in Nepal right now? Things of that nature. Because obviously they're going to have a lot of economic problems there. They're going to be there to help them assist and recover, if that's possible, as bad as that situation is. Now, shortly after World War II, this was not Bretton Woods Agreement, but shortly after World War II, the world got together and signed a treaty called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. This was called GATT. Now, GATT ceased to exist as an organization, but the treaty was still there. It just passed over to another world organization called the World Trade Organization, which is still in effect today. So GATT, was the predecessor to the WTO. All right. GATT was created in 1947, and nations would join GATT and then would pledge to reduce trade barriers. The way that this was supposed to work was each GATT member would treat every other GATT member with Most Favored Nation status, or MFN. Most Favored Nation status was the way you treated your best trading partner with certain exceptions. They wanted to promote reducing trade barriers. And in turn, facilitate multinational trade negotiations. Everybody worked together. They were extremely effective in reducing tariffs for the member nations, not so much the quotas or the NQNTBs. Part of that was the exceptions. If you belong to a regional trading bloc, then the preference you gave to your regional trading bloc partners did not have to be given to Most Favored Nation status. In other words, if you're in a regional trading bloc and you give company X these great advantages, well, that becomes your best trading partner. That's not what you use for Most Favored Nation status. Most Favored Nation status is how do you treat your best non-trading bloc partner. See, other countries create a lot of trading blocs. And could block it and say, well, I don't have to give you Most Favored Nation status. All right, the United States used this next one. You could grant more preferential treatment for less developed countries than you did for industrialized nations. Did we use that politically? And if you were a communist country, well, we wouldn't give you hardly anything. Other exceptions. The British government could give special exceptions for New Zealand, Australia, Canada, their former colonies and trading partners. What they got didn't count as what they had to give Most Favored Nation status. Because, they're still the British Commonwealth. Okay? Well, that worked for other of your former colonial powers like France. They didn't have to give as many privileges, if you will, to they did their former colonies. So there were a lot of exceptions, and that's why it just didn't work to the degree that everybody had hoped. Now, as I said, on December the 31st, one year, GATT as an organization ceased to exist. And the next morning, the WTO existed. So basically, y'all, if you worked for GATT, well, you went to bed that night, woke up the next morning, you worked for the WTO. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade is still there. It's still in existence. Now it's administered by the WTO. So the year, I don't care, y'all, about knowing the year, but it was 94 to 95 that it switched. So on December the 31st, 1994, GATT ceased to exist as an organization. On January the 1st, 1995, the WTO took over. Their mandate is broader. Their enforcement penalties are better. They're not as global. I mean, they are as global, but their ideas aren't as global. WTO tries to take it a project at a time. Let's work on this, get this taken care of. Now let's work on that and get that taken care of. So what the WTO initiatives are extremely important. Because, does every country that's wanting the trade benefits push for their trade benefits to be the initiative of the WTO? This has turned out to be very controversial. And a lot of their first meetings back in the 1990s, turned into outright riots. Because everybody that wanted something done by all this organization would show up in protest. And, like we've seen in Baltimore the last few days, eventually some of those turned violent. One was in Denver, One was in Seattle. And the one in Denver was the first one, and they didn't expect this, and it just got to be a real big mess. Now, as of 2013, there's 157 countries of the world in the WTO. They continue with GATT's initiatives, but more specific, if you will. So their goals are broader, but let's accomplish it one step at a time type thing. So let's look at some of their current initiatives. A lot of these, last over decades. It's not like they meant, let's do this, finish it, start the next one. There may be several work at the same time. GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Services, is trying to reduce trade barriers in service. Remember, your gross domestic product is the products you make and the services you provide. Well, the service industry is huge. This is trying to reduce the trade barriers on the service industry. The Trade-Related Investment Measures Agreement, or TRIM, they're trying to come up with rules on international investments, FDI, FPI, and make it unanimous. Remember I told you how some countries have limitations on you, others don't? This is trying to make it uniform around the world. TRIP is an even bigger one, y'all. This is the Trade-Related Intellectual Property Rights. Okay, go back to intellectual property. Remember how we talked about certain countries of the world do not recognize intellectual property laws, like China? Is China a member of the WTO? Yes. Is China a country that regularly doesn't play by the rules that we talked about in the last chapter? Yes. Did China agree to do all kinds of things when they were admitted into this? Do they do it? No. One of the big ones that's been going on, y'all, since almost the beginning of the WTO is, and however you want to pronounce this, you can. I've heard it pronounced just about any way in the world, in agriculture. Because, one of the most biggest, what am I trying to say? The largest colossal failures of GATT was in agriculture. So the Doha Round tries to reduce trade barriers on food and agricultural products. Do a lot of countries of the world make a lot of the food products, but then do they make the countries pay to get it and use it politically and as a weapon? This is trying to reduce that. Now remember, one of the exceptions that was long recognized was regional trading blocks. Okay, because of that, there's been this big boom in regional trading blocks around the world. Countries enter into these to promote regional economic growth and better lives for a group of countries. The incentive to join this is you get advantages from the other member nations. And then remember, you don't have to pass that on as most favored nation status under GATT and then the successor WTO. There's 4 types of these regional trading blocks. and they build upon each other. Okay, at the very bottom is a free trade area. A free trade area is where the member nations say, let's lower our trade barriers. Okay, let's do it. Well, that's going to take years. Yeah, it is. Let's work toward doing it. Okay, let's do it. That's all it is. All right, the next one is a customs union. Y'all think of the name, customs union. Putting the customs of the country together into this organization, being more uniform. Well, that's what that one's hinting on. And then they build on each other. Let's take them one at a time. Free trade area. This one, y'all, is what NAFTA is. The North American Free Trade Area. United States, Canada, Mexico. In NAFTA, the United States, Canada, and Mexico agreed to reduce their trade barriers with each nation. Okay, y'all, this was entered into during the administration of Bill Clinton. Are we still working to get the trade barriers down? Not so much between Canada and the United States. If anything, y'all, there's probably more trade barriers now between Canada and the United States than there were when Clinton was in office because of 9/11. Now, we used to have basically an open border with Canada. It's not open anymore. But the big emphasis here was Mexico. The United States had pretty good trade with Mexico. We had great trade with Canada. Did Canada and Mexico have almost zero trade? Well, this was to encourage the Mexican government to have more trade with Canada and open up more market. But all they agree to do is drop the trade barriers. Okay, y'all, this thing's been in effect now for over 20 years, or nearly 20 years. Are we still working to try to get it to work right? There's still problems being worked out with NAFTA. All right, do you see a lot more a lot more Mexican banks if you're from the San Antonio or down in the valley doing business in the country? Do you see Mexican buses running up and down Interstate 35? But Mexican trucking, it's been a little bit bigger of a problem, for instance. Because can you pack a lot of drugs in Mexican trucks? You can put them in buses too, but, anyway. That's all that one does. Now, a customs union is a free trade area, plus the members start to say, let's have common trade policies toward non-member nations. Okay, y'all, can the United States still treat England any way we want to? Do Canada and Mexico have any say-so under NAFTA rules in how we trade with England or Sweden or any other country of the world? No. Okay, if you're in a customs union, you all agree to have a common trade policy with non-member nations. You're starting to put the economies of the countries together and act the same with non-member nations. Now, by the time you get to a common market, well, y'all listen to the name, common market. This is where you say, well, we're going to drop all trade barriers as far as labor, capital, any factor of production, and for that matter, if one country is better at producing something, but yet the other country has the raw materials or even the people, well, then we'll move it around and shift it, and the other countries will agree, let you make that, and then we won't be in competition. After all, you're better at it. Now, y'all, can you see that you're really starting to put the economies of the country together here? You're going to specialization with services, raw material, goods, everything. Putting the economies of the countries together, starting to. All right? Remember, a common market is also a customs union. So do they have the same agreements on how to deal with non-member nations? And it's also a free trade area, so are they dropping the trade barriers, which should be obvious with that one. Then there's one more step, and that's called an economic union. And that's where you have completed the process. You've put the economies of the countries together. You've made a government of governments, if you will. where all the countries economically act as one. You put the macro and the micro economic policies together. Everything's the same. Yeah, this causes for a lot of national sovereignty to go out the window. Okay, your big example of this one is the European Union. And the EU is a very powerful organization. And do they protect European interests? And when the EU speaks to all the countries in the European Union, pretty much have to follow suit. It's a government of governments. Does it have its own flag? Does it have its own government, which is all outlined in your book and outline? This is not an EU government class, so I'm not going to go through that and try to teach you EU government. But if you look at it, it's not exactly the same as the Europe. I mean, there's 4 major parts, whereas the United States technically has 3 major parts. But is it real similar to the government of the United States, if you look at it? Now, there's no president or anything of that nature. It's ruled by committee of all the nations. But otherwise, yeah. All right, so what are the advantages of this? Well, you don't have to give most favored nation status as you do with your trade partners to other members of the WTO now. And that region, hopefully, if it works, some did, some didn't, if it works, will it help build up the economies of those member nations? Okay, NAFTA. Has it been exceptionally good for Mexico? And has helped the Mexican economy greatly. Has it also had problems? Does Mexico have the same environmental laws we have? And so does Mexico build plants along the Texas border, and then when the wind blows north, do we get all their pollution? All right, is that another thing that's being addressed right now with Mexico? And has Mexico agreed to up their pollution control? Whether they will or not, we'll have to wait and see. It may increase international competitiveness. Did a lot of countries want to come into probably Mexico because it had cheaper labor costs, build their products there, then be called Mexican-made? Then could they take advantage of free trade across the border and send their goods as NAFTA-made without any trade barriers into the United States and Canada? Whereas the United States might have had a trade barrier against that country. But once they built the plant in Mexico, it's Mexican-made, they could ship it in for free. Would that help the Mexican economy? Getting new businesses in, more opportunities for people to work in Mexico. Would they need to cross the Rio Grande as illegal immigrants to try to find a job here? Are most of our illegal immigrants now from Mexico? No, they're from a lot further south. Okay? Not the recent ones. Because the Mexican economy is rebounding. It's doing better. Now, the European Union, remember, is one extreme, NAFTA is the other. And like I said, the European Union, has grown a lot in the last few years. It's a major force. 25% of the world's gross domestic product. This is a monster trading partner. All right, it created years ago in 1957, y'all. So almost 60 years ago. With 6 nations as a common market. Italy, France, West Germany, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Netherlands. All right, y'all. The big 3 there are Italy, France, and West Germany. Okay, who was on what side in World War II? Did France get run over by Germany real fast? Was that the same thing that happened in World War I? Was France getting tired of being run over by Germany? So instead of building that impenetrable Maginot Line, did they decide, let's trade with West Germany? Remember, y'all, this was when Germany was a divided country, and East Germany was communist, so they didn't count. Let's trade with Germany, because after all, if we're good trading partners, maybe they won't invade us again. And after all, Italy, you did too, so you can come too. Well, y'all, the Benelux nations, when Germany avoided the Great Maginot Line, did they go through Belgium, Luxembourg, and in through that way? Yeah. So let's get all of us together. Let's trade together so I'm safer. See why France would push this? Okay. Benelux nations, y'all. Belgium, B-E, Ne, Netherlands, Lux, Luxembourg. Don't forget that all-important Luxembourg, y'all. About the size of Brazos County, remember. Okay? But it's still one of the independent nations of Europe. Then they grew very slowly. In the 1970s, they added 3 nations. Denmark, Ireland, and the all-important United Kingdom. That was the monster one. Y'all, do England and France get along? Not on much. Well, now they're going to trade together and have open policy and put their economies together. They renamed it from the European Economic Community to the European Community. But y'all, all through this time period, they called it the Common Market. Okay? I don't care what the name was. Then in the 1980s, they added 3 more countries. This time they go south. They get Greece, Greece, Spain, and Portugal. And they would love to redo that one. Okay? Did the monster changes come in 1993? That's the Treaty of Maastricht. That's how one of my students told me to pronounce it. If that's wrong, then he lied to me. But this created the EU. They took that next step from a common market to an economic union in 1993. They also added Finland. Now they go north, y'all. Finland, Sweden, and Austria, which is not exactly north, but it's high up. So, there you go. Since then, they've gone crazy. They did this slow, steady growth. But in 2004, they added 10 nations, making Russia very mad. Because we're almost all of these nations either Warsaw Pact nations that Russia occupied after World War II, or even some of them, y'all, were former Soviet republics of the USSR. So this really made Russia mad, but they didn't care. Czech Republic, that's Prague, y'all. Okay? The better half of Czechoslovakia. But Slovak's in there too. So Slovakia and the Republic, or the Slovak Republic's there also. So both of them. Estonia. Okay, y'all find Estonia on a map for me. Quick, go. Yeah, it's up there. But y'all, former Soviet nation? Yes. Okay. Hungary, former Warsaw Pact nation. Latvia, Lithuania, 2 more former Soviet republics. Y'all, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are right there in between Poland and Russia. Okay. Poland, Slovenia. Okay, if you can't find those others, I dare you to find Slovenia. And then Malta and Cyprus. Y'all, what are Malta and Cyprus? Islands between out in the Mediterranean. Is one of them about half Turkish and half European? Okay, that's a big deal because y'all, does Turkey want in real bad into the European Union? Well, now wait a minute. European Union? Y'all, Turkey actually has claims to both Asia and Europe. So geographically they count. Algeria or one of the other countries in North Africa tried and they said, you're not in Europe. And they turned them down. Since then, they've added Bulgaria and Romania. Then they added Croatia. Okay? See, they've just gone nuts in the last few years, and they might have expanded too fast, too quickly. Now, the government, there's your 4 primary things, that type of stuff. As long as you know what they are and what they do, that's all I care about. I don't care how many representatives, who puts them in. A lot of it is dominated by the larger nations. Germany, okay, being the biggest force in the EU. Now, Treaty of Maastricht did one other thing. It created the Eurozone and the EU. The Euro. It created the EU too, but it created the Euro. Now, the Euro is the common currency now of Europe, but does England use it? No. Why would they switch from the best currency in the world? Sweden doesn't use it. And there's some other countries that chose not to use it. Denmark. And then there's some others that their economy is so bad they're not allowed to use it. Greece wasn't at first. Then they let them, and now they wish they hadn't. Because y'all, it's Greece pulling the EU down big time. They had to bail them out I don't know how many times. But that's Euroland or the Eurozone is the countries that use the euro. Now, NAFTA is the exact opposite, y'all. It's just a free trade area. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to just tell you to review it. We've talked about most of it, of what I wanted you to know about it, so no big deal as far as skipping over it, because it's still the same three countries. Other countries have asked to join, we haven't let them. Chile was one of the biggest ones wasn't allowed in. We've still got enough to work out between Mexico, Canada, and the United States, much less somebody else. Now, one thing that I do want to put in there is there are FDI restrictions in NAFTA. Remember, you wanted Mexico to get industry and build up their economies so that their citizens didn't have to cross the Rio Grande and be illegal immigrants. But you wanted it to be where they would be competitive. See, there's all kinds of restrictions put on NAFTA-made products. And depending on the product, a certain percentage of it has to originate from the raw materials from Mexico, Canada, and the United States. Which is ironic, y'all, because some of the American-made cars didn't qualify as NAFTA-made because so many of the components were made in the Orient. Did we have to, or General Motors and Ford, have to move plants from the Orient to Mexico to get them to be NAFTA made? What they're trying to avoid is what's called a screwdriver plant. They did not want, say, okay, back then y'all, Sweden still owned Volvo. So let's say they didn't want, or Saab, let's use Saab. Well, either one, I don't care. They didn't want them to build a Volvo plant in Mexico, ship the whole car over except for the hood and the trunk, and then just have Mexico put the hood and the trunk on, and then it'd be NAFTA made. So a certain percentage of all kinds of different products have to originate there. That's to avoid the screwdriver plants, where you just have to turn a screw to get it done, and it's not really made in Mexico. Also, each country could protect certain industries. We protected our broadcasting. We already talked about the airlines. It can't be more than 25% foreign owned. Canada protected its cultural industries because Canada is really trying to compete with the U.S., making TV shows, things of that nature. Mexico, keep your grubby paws off our oil, was Mexico's stay away from. NAFTA's been exceptionally good for Mexico, but now we've seen the move to go to China and the outsourcing to China because it's even better. So where NAFTA's going, who knows? Whether we'll ever expand it, who knows? But look over, and y'all, I'm basically out of time. So I'm just going to, because I got to save some for evaluations, y'all. Look over the other ones. In South America, you have two major ones. Texan way of saying it, Mercosur, and then the Andean Pact. Those two have merged. Then you got ASEAN, which was the Southeast Asian nations of 1967. This was a free trade area. Basically, if you look at the member nations, it's the Four Tigers and the copiers of the Four Tigers and some other nations. But the monster one that's still being put together is called APEC. And if you'll listen, you'll hear a lot about this one. This one's supposed to go into competition with the EU. and take it on head on. This thing will be 40% of the world's trade, where the EU is only 25%. But y'all look at the nations it includes. It includes every nation basically that touches the Pacific Ocean, with some exceptions. But you go from the tip of South America all the way around to Australia and New Zealand. That Pacific Rim, those are the nations. So that means U.S., Japan, Russia, China. Have you ever seen those four agree on anything? So y'all, getting this one off the ground is going to be monstrous. They've been fighting it all through the Bush administration, Obama administration. We'll see how it goes. But anyway, that's your material. That's I know I kind of blitzed through that, but you can read the last of 16 and get all of that.